With a population of nearly 1.4 billion and a massive economy, China is a big deal. And its relationship with the U.S. is complicated. China represents a major market for U.S. goods, though many believe it seeks to displace the U.S. as the primary power in the Asia-Pacific region. As an ally of North Korea, China has frustrated U.S. attempts to pressure the North Koreans to denuclearize. And after flexing their muscles in the South and East China Seas, China also seeks to gain influence around the world through its $1 trillion One Belt, One Road economic investment initiative. Furthermore, at the end of February, the Chinese Communist Party proposed to abolish presidential term limits, paving the way for President Xi Jinping to be the most powerful Chinese ruler since Mao. What does all this mean going forward for the U.S.? And what can we learn from Chinese history? And do we have anything to fear? This is Snack Break. I'm Aroop Mukharji, and here to help us understand Chinese policy is Dr. Liz Perry, a professor of government at Harvard University, director of the Harvard Yenching Institute, and author and editor of over 20 books on China and Chinese history. Liz, thank you so much for joining. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, let's start with the most basic question about China. What does China want?
China officially wants the China dream. And what is the China dream? It's not the American dream.
Sounds
the American,
a lot like it.
Sounds like it. But the American dream, I believe, is a car in every garage.
White picket fences.
And white picket fences.
Golden retriever.
Your own house, your own mortgage, so on and so forth. The Chinese dream is a collective dream. It is presented by the government to the Chinese people as what any good Chinese should want, and that is a strong and rich China. So it's a sense of national progress, not individual progress. Now, how many individuals share that, I can't tell you because we don't have good information on that. But I think there is within China a general desire for a country that is stronger on the world stage, a country that is no longer humiliated as it has felt it has been for the past century and a half. But there are lots of differences within China about how that should be achieved and how ultimately the Chinese dream should really look.
I mean, how does the Chinese dream be, if you want status or national prosperity, doesn't that depend on the individual dream? Doesn't that require each person to have prosperity or to be rich in that sense?
Well, I think that the Chinese government certainly doesn't see a contradiction between individual people being rich and the country being rich. But it is really trying to get people to have a nationalistic sentiment about China and to view this as a collective more than simply an individual enterprise. China is still, by per capita income, an extremely poor nation, $4,000 per capita approximately. It has a long way to go to catch up with the advanced developed world in that respect. But the Chinese economy, of course, is the second biggest in the world, by some accounts already the biggest in the world. And so if we think of this as national, in national terms, it's on a scale that's very different from the individual level and that's very inspiring to people who are Chinese.
What does this mean for the United States? If the United States has a greater appreciation of the Chinese national identity for these sorts of national aspirations, what should the U.S. do? There's this concern that the growing power will want more say in its neighborhood and in the rest of the world, and this threat that people talk about to the international order or global governance and economic systems and institutions. Should the United States, how should that sort of historical narrative inform U.S. policy?
Well, I think it's difficult to give a simple answer to that question because it's not always obvious how the Chinese are going to interpret their own history. As we mentioned, it is a very complicated history. It's a history in which China, for much of its existence, was not a very strong power. So it was humiliated in the mid-19th century, but in fact, for many periods before that, it had divided and then reunited, divided again, and so forth. So being aware of Chinese history is aware also of the fact, I think, that this country has certain fragilities within it and certain tendencies toward divisiveness that perhaps make us understand a little more why the Chinese narrative puts so much emphasis on not being humiliated and on being united. So I don't think that we need always fear when Chinese rhetoric is as seemingly arrogant, or as Chinese would say, proud, as it comes across. I think sometimes that's for a domestic audience to make Chinese feel better about a situation that they're really quite frightened about. It of course depends on how the leaders in place in China interpret this history, and we've seen in the leaders of the PRC, from Mao, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping, all quite different approaches to the world. That's been partly because of the level of development at which China has been under each of those leaders, but it's also been partially a reflection of the temperament and the ambitions of those individual leaders. So I don't think we can simply say because history is very important and because Chinese culture is really important to the Chinese leadership as political discourse that necessarily means that China is going to be a threat on the world stage. On the other hand, when we look at Xi Jinping himself, I think we can state with some degree of confidence that this is a highly ambitious leader who is ambitious not only domestically but internationally, and who does want a world in which China is going to be a much more prominent and much more decisive player on the world stage.
Yeah, so let's talk about Xi. Chinese Communist Party has announced this proposal to abolish presidential term limits, and this allows Xi Jinping to become leader for life, or president for life. What do we make of that?
Well, it might or might not allow him to become leader for life. It is actually, it's being framed about term limits. And so it would, at the end of each 5-year term, nevertheless, even though one would have to not resign at the end of 2 terms, it doesn't mean that there wouldn't still be terms, as I understand it. So he might or might not be renewed in the future. But clearly, it's indicative of his ambition to have the option of remaining for life. And that's very worrisome to me as someone who was hopeful in the 1980s and 1990s that China was becoming more institutionalized politically. I never was under the illusion that it was really democratizing, but it seemed to be regularizing, and having a kind of institutionalized succession process was very important to that, both term limits and age limits. And the threat to do away with that, I think, is very troubling, particularly to Chinese intellectuals. I don't know how ordinary Chinese feel about this. I was intrigued the other day in my seminar when some of my students whose parents are Chinese and are in China, some of my students told me that their parents who live in the countryside were very enthusiastic. About this.
Really?
They were delighted that this strong leader could really remain in place for longer than 5 more years. But I have not heard that sentiment from any intellectuals in China, from any university professors, or from the government officials who I know well, who are personal close friends. From all those quarters, regardless of whether people are on the left or on the right politically, there has been a real sense that this is not good for China.
I mean, Economist had an article that said that the U.S. doesn't just have an economic rival; it now is going to have an ideological rival, which sort of smacks of this kind of Cold War discourse of, I mean, not necessarily good versus evil, but in a sense, 2 different ideological camps. Do you think that holds water?
Well, I do think this is of concern to us. I do think China under Xi Jinping is increasingly making an effort to present itself as an alternative to the United States. Whether I would call that ideological or not is clearly China would like it to be ideological, and that is why Xi Jinping's own thought for socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, it is formally known, was written into the Constitution, the first time since Mao that a sitting top official has had his thought written into the Constitution. But I've spent a lot of time reading his works, and I have a hard time saying exactly what that ideology is, to be honest, beyond the idea that the Chinese Communist Party should really be in control. Socialism with Chinese characteristics seems to really mean the party has to play a stronger role in people's lives. It has to play a stronger role in universities. It has to play a stronger role in the economy. It cannot retreat under forces of marketization and so on. When Deng Xiaoping coined the phrase socialism with Chinese characteristics, he was basically talking about market reforms. So we would still keep socialism, which meant rule by the Chinese Communist Party, but socialism with Chinese characteristics meant that unlike the old Soviet Union, this would not be a command economy, it would be a marketized economy. Under Xi Jinping, the reinterpretation of socialism with Chinese characteristics seems to be the emphasis on the Communist Party, not on the market side of this. But it doesn't seem to be very well developed ideologically. That is to say, it's basically about how a Leninist party is in control. And until it develops some kinds of real political values that are new and distinctive and appealing to people, it seems to me it's hard to see it as an ideology with a great deal of appeal. So she has articulated what he calls 12 socialist core values. But most of those are what we would consider to be Western values of democracy and freedom and the like. And so what's really distinctive about this ideology, except that we're to have a very strong Leninist party in control, is not yet clear.
The extension of these fears that there are these two camps is not necessarily just existentially you have another country that is an alternative, but that country will affect the global governance system, that it will affect the organization of international institutions. This idea that China might challenge the international order. I mean, there's these, you know, the lead economist article, the lead foreign affairs article is that how the West got China wrong, how the U.S. got China wrong, and the implication being that they are going to you know, operate according to their own rules. Not according to the rules you know, that the West set up in the 1940s. Do you think that's right? Do you think that, or do you think that's a little exaggerated?
I think that's a little exaggerated. I think we're living in this highly ironic world where it's the United States that is torpedoing that post-World War II order that the United States put in place with Bretton Woods and the IMF and so forth, and which has served us very well for the past half century plus, and which has served most of the rest of the world well, and which has served China well since the implementation of reforms in the late 70s and early 1980s. And although, yes, I think much of this socialism with Chinese characteristics is for a domestic audience to make China strong, that Xi Jinping is not being duplicitous when he goes to Davos and speaks in positive terms about globalization and the world order, because he's quite aware that this world order has been really good for China's economic development. With the United States now threatening tariffs on steel and so forth, saying that trade wars are good things for the international economy, it seems to me we're in this very bizarre situation where it's we ourselves who may be the biggest threat to the world order, and China actually is quite anxious to maintain much of the status quo at the present. Now, who knows, a decade, 2 decades from now, what that will mean. And certainly you mentioned One Belt, One Road initiative, which is one example of Xi Jinping's ambition for the future, putting huge amounts of money into this infrastructure across the world. But let's not forget, at the time of the international financial crisis in 2008, people were criticizing China for not investing enough in the global economy, saying China was keeping all of its money at home instead of investing abroad. Now when China does it, of course, in a way that China views will be good for its own future energy security and the like. Nevertheless, it perhaps is not entirely fair to criticize China for finally spending outside its own borders.
I mean, the main issue is that we got to stay #1, right? Just tell me that the U.S. is going to be #1 in 10 or 20 years. I mean, we still got, right? We still got innovation. We still got the best universities. We've got, we're the home of the Big Mac.
I think 10 or 20 years, you know, we might be okay.
Yeah. After that.
After that, I'm not so sure.
Don't say that. Well, I mean, this is. Do you think that prosperity? I mean, 'cause China is challenging all these political science theories about whether or not prosperity leads to democratization, whether or not liberalization or opening up to the other countries of the world will lead to these sorts of things. Whether or not this, embedded liberalism or all these things that could affect a country like China are getting challenged by the status quo. Is that right?
I think that is right. I think we have two huge challenges to that kind of conventional Western social science. One is China, which is getting increasingly rich, but seems to be getting less and less on the road to democracy as it does so. The other is India, which was never rich and yet has maintained a remarkably robust democracy for all this period of time. And both of those countries are countries with very rich historical resources to draw on, distinctive forms of state-society relations that are very, very different from each other, and that I think give it the capacity to do things in ways that our sort of routine social science has a very hard time capturing. But on the university side, I must say I am worried. Yeah. And part of it, I believe, is our own fault because we've bought into these ridiculous rankings of global research universities. The Chinese have figured out how to game that system. The Chinese Communist Party invests in precisely the metrics that raise the rankings of its universities. And it's not a trivial thing. We could laugh at it and say, well, it doesn't make any difference if Tsinghua is ranked above MIT or Beida among Harvard. Right? And we have families all around the world who are trying to figure out where to invest their tuition dollars because they can send their kids to higher education anywhere. And right now, the U.S. is the best bet for them. And American higher education has benefited enormously from the fact that the best and the brightest and the richest come to American higher education. But once we are eclipsed, if we are eclipsed by Chinese higher education, that puts an advantage in the court of Beijing and Shanghai that can be very problematic for us. So I really do worry on a number of different levels. I think we would be foolish to be complacent about all this.
Well, how do you feel about eating right now?
Eating sounds good.
You sound like that?
Eating
okay.
always sounds good.
So, hey, we got a special. Isabel, do you mind bringing out the? Somebody, thank you so much. So this is a Japanese. Your favorite snack is a Japanese savory snack called sembei.
That's correct.
It is a rice cracker, essentially, but it comes in all sorts of varieties.
Well, these look very good. Very nice job.
Is it?
Yeah, very nice job.
Oh, there.
Do you like these?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I've recently been investing in rice cakes. I mean, these are basically flavored.
Yeah.
These are a little bit denser. It looks like they've got little, like, soy sauce bombs or something in here. Or some sort of savory flavoring.
I'm not quite sure what's in these, but basically the sembei are rice crackers and then deep fat fried often or baked, and then they often have some kind of soy covering, sometimes seaweed as well.
As a first on Snackwork, you've brought your own rice treats. Now, tell me what these are.
These are all varieties of sembei. So here are ones that are called bean-like.
I've seen those little things in, like American Airlines has their like packaged snacks.
Oh,
and it'll be like a Chex Mix, and they'll throw in those things. And I've always wondered what they are in their Japanese rice snacks.
Why don't you,
Here, let's get it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, let's get it in there.
We'll give you a chance to grab a handful of here,
and
you can see what they're like.
No, you got, and these little boomerangs. These little.
They have a little bit of spice in them. Are they a little bit spicy? Maybe not these. Usually they do.
Oh, no, for sure. They little got a kick.
Yeah.
And you, how did you get involved in the Japanese snacks? What?
I grew up in Japan.
So right. So you've been having these for
many decades.
For 5-6 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
20 years.
Yeah.
This is just to remind you of childhood. Is that what?
Well, probably partly because of growing up in Japan, I've just always had a preference for savory over sweet snacks, and soy sauce to me just tastes remarkably good.
I have it straight
Rice
sometimes,
tastes remarkably
just straight
good.
from the bottle.
Well, I don't go quite that far, but I do think it's It's tasty.
Yeah.
And
This is
goes
great.
very well with beer, and especially Japanese beer, if you like it.
A missed opportunity.
Yeah, we could.
That could have been really fun. Be our first alcoholic snack break.
Well, you'll have to invite me back. You know.
I will. I got a question for you. We got just a few minutes left. Do you consider yourself more a historian or a political scientist?
Well, I consider myself more a political scientist because I've never actually taken any graduate work in history, and all my degrees, undergraduate and graduate, are in political science. I've probably been offered more jobs in history than in political science, to be honest, but I've never actually accepted them. I've only accepted ones that are political science or international studies, because my own training having been in political science, I like training students in political science, and I like teaching courses in political science. And actually, honestly, about half my writing, I consciously am gearing it more toward a historical audience, historian's audience, and the other half toward a political science audience. And so I like combining the two of them.
With history, political science, do you think that historians and political scientists should weigh in on policy debates more often than they do?
Well, I don't know if they should, but I think it's refreshing when they do. Let me put it that way. I think scholars should weigh in if they feel comfortable and should not feel pressure to do so if they don't.
Right.
And that's one of the great things about the American Academy, in my view, is that scholars can maintain as much distance from the kind of policy government arena as they want to, and that's fine. Or they can really try to engage with it, and that's fine too. One of the things that I always find a little bit uncomfortable about the Chinese academic world is that academics there tend to be so interested in having their ideas incorporated as government policy. And I think sometimes that can be detrimental to scholarship if you're writing and speaking in ways that you hope are going to capture public attention. And so I think people should do what they feel comfortable with in all of this. But it doesn't just have to be people who are trained in policy or in security studies who should be commenting on contemporary affairs.
Well, we're so lucky to have you join us today and talk a little bit about Chinese policy and your research and your thoughts on everything that's going on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This was great fun.
All right. This is Snack Break. I'm Aroop Mukharji. Today we had Professor Liz Perry, Professor of Government at Harvard University, join us today. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.